Welcome to the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast with your hosts, Daniel Mendonca and Scott Babcock. Welcome into the show. This is If You Build It, Will They Learn? I'm Scott Babcock, and with me as always is your co-host, Daniel Mendonca. It is good to be back. Daniel, how are you?
Good. We got some great feedback the first time around on episode number 1. So excited to kind of go into episode number 2 here. Guns a-blazing.
I like it. I think that one of the things that we heard pretty consistently from everyone was that we may have scripted a bit too much in the first episode. So I'm excited that it's going to be less of that. We felt a little nerves, I think, in the first episode. So the conversation should be better this time.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so for today's topic, we are going to tackle a word that everyone is very familiar with in the learning industry. It has been around the block a few times over the last couple of years, and that is microlearning. One of the things that I think we're excited to talk about today is that I think if you asked around 10 people in the industry, what is microlearning, have them explain it a little bit, you're probably going to get pretty varied responses back from the community. So we want to spend some time on that today. I'm excited about this topic because I think it's going to be no small feat to talk about such a gigantic subject. And with that is your first dad pun of the day. So here we go.
Awesome. So, Scott, I think in this way, let's start by defining microlearning. Let's get very technical. Let's get a scripted definition. I did some Googling to make sure that we were official. So I'm just gonna read this out to you. Okay. So microlearning deals with the relatively small learning units and short-term learning activities. The term is used in e-learning and related fields in the sense of learning processes in mediated environments. Microlearning is a holistic approach for a skill-based. Should I keep going, or is that vague and wishy-washy enough for us to kind of start this conversation?
I don't think we want to start the show with putting our users to sleep. So maybe we stop there. We'll take a pause and kind of try to set it up for the way we define microlearning, or maybe the way we think about it. And I don't know if it'll shed clarity, but at least do a little bit to set the stage for the way we think about it. I think when I think about microlearning as a whole and sort of the word that has been floated around and the approach that we take, I sort of think of three, call it categories in which you can kind of define or refine that word. And the first is objectives, learning objectives. The second is in kind of overall time, and then actually reduction of training time or seat time. Thoughts on if there's one of those that sort of resonates with you, Daniel, in the way you might think about it a little bit?
Yeah, I think from personally and how I view microlearning, it's really understood about time and objection. And I think about where the Mendoza line is on, those two things. Really, I look at it as kind of a bite-sized chunk that I can take as needed, just in time. Maybe, as I'm looking for information, I can easily come across something small that is straight to the point on a single objective that I'm trying to achieve. So that's typically the one I look for, quick bite size. Now quick and bite size is a relative term. Going back to what we talked about in reduction, which I think is where your view kind of comes in. But I really think it is, can we identify one learning objective and get that across in a short span of time?
Yeah, and I think those are sort of good benchmarks as you're designing and planning for the way you deliver microlearning. But I think a lot of organizations are probably looking at this in a very different light. They're in different positions. They've kind of come along their journey and their path and the way they're developing. But while it'd be great to say I'm going to have 30, 60, 90 second delivery, or I'm going to focus on a single objective or a single topic or a single product, a lot of them are still trying to get just reduced down. So is it that they have 90-minute training or they have 60-minute training and they're just trying to get it to 45 or 30 or 20 minutes? In sort of taking a walk run approach to microlearning as a whole, I think they'd like to get to a place where they are really looking at reducing the time, but maybe right now that's not realistic to get to 1 or 2 minutes of training in bite-sized chunks like that. So I do think it is relative. I think it's a really good way to look at it. I think most organizations are treating it as such. Some are probably further along again in that journey and that progression. So a lot of different ways to define it. I think everyone has their own. I think that is what makes this a bit of a tricky definition segment for a lot of folks, is that they're not all looking at it through the kind of the same prism or point of view.
Yeah, I think on that note, one of the things that you mentioned, I think, is you may have a 30, 60, or 90-minute training for onboarding, which I think we're going to get into a little bit, but that breakup or reduction in time and having 5 to 7 minute seat times or 10-minute seat times across 8 to 9 learnings maybe is a way to take in information and kind of put it into some sort of curriculum or pathway that has micro chunks into some sort of larger learning objective. I think all of those are really great, and I think that what we've seen in working with our client partners and conducting these trainings, I think really comes down to some tactical questions that we may have to ask ourselves when we're developing them, which I think you alluded to, which is, who are you trying to train, and what makes sense for them. All right, Scott, what do you think microlearning is? Here to stay or just a buzzword?
So often in L&D, we tend to look for the flavor of the month, or we're looking for the next great thing that's going to really make training resonate with our learners, our users. And it's always hard, I think, in the moment, but we've got some legs behind this topic to determine, is this really a long-term strategy that organizations should be tackling? Yes, it's a little vague. You might be a little bit further or newer to the journey of getting into microlearning, but we've been talking about it for a few years, so it indicates to me that it is here to stay, that this is the way of the future. But I think there's some discussion points that have to go into that. Daniel, what's your take on it? Here to stay or buzzword?
Yeah, I think that you make a good point about us talking about it for so long, but I think that the reason why, and maybe not I'm leaning towards buzzword, but I feel like it's very buzzworthy, is in a lot of client discussions that I'm having, a lot of discovery periods and informative periods with potential customers. They're all talking about developing microlearning. We need to go micro, and I think where we lose sight of is micro is not right for everyone. And going back to the name of the podcast, if you build it, will they learn? I think we have to ask the question of, who is the audience? So, and who is the trainer? So, trainer and trainee, what type of training are they used to seeing? And what type of training are we delivering to them? So if we're talking about an onboarding curriculum, I think you have to understand that dividing an onboarding curriculum up into 10, 12, 15, 20, 3 to 5 minute seat time, and even that would be a stretch in terms of the definition of micro, but is that really of value to the person who's being trained? Is going through 15 different 3 to 5 minute trainings, does that make sense? Or does sitting behind a computer or on your device, because you can't start your job until you're done the training, make sense to engage in a 30-minute seat time learning? So I really think understanding the audience is important, and then assessing the necessary modality related to it. So microlearning, although probably here to stay, because I think it's a valuable, especially in today's world where I think that the average, I think the stat is, and I wish I had the official stat right in front of me, but that since 2000 or 2010, I think it is, till 2020, there's been more content distributed on the internet than in all the years prior. And with that being said, sorry, not even just on the internet, that includes TV, radio, etc. So you take that, I think it really puts down to is why micro? Okay, we want to keep the attention of the user, but is it the right modality at the right time? I think it's the question we need to ask. And I just talked it in like 3 circles, did a dance, a twirl. But I think that's the point, is what's the philosophy and the strategy around the learning? Who are you trying to train? And does it make sense to deliver your objectives in a micro fashion?
Yeah, I tend to agree with some of those premises in terms of it being a bit buzzwordy, and I think with that maybe is the notion that organizations may be trying to force fit that to their culture because they think they have to. So you make some good points in terms of just, is it the right fit and does it make sense? Um, as Daniel will attest, and many of you will learn if you keep listening to the podcast, I love a great analogy. I'm always trying to find a way to make things make sense in my head, at least. And we promised you Marvel. So I was thinking about this in between as we were kind of prepping for the show, and Ant-Man kept coming into my brain in all the right ways. So, and I was thinking about, a pretty good parallel to what we're talking about in microlearning is, when we think about Ant-Man as a superhero, most people would probably resonate to him being small and tiny. He's fast, nimble, powerful, and that speaks to that just-in-time moment of being able to get you what you want when you need it. Really impactful, to the point. I'm not sure that insect communication is likely related to training. So that's a win he's got in that column. But the reality is, if you're familiar with sort of the character and the concept, is he can not only go small, but he can shape to go large when it fits into the narrative of the story, or when that's the way to solve that particular heroic feat that he needs to accomplish. He can become gigantic man or giant man, and in many ways, I think that is. We talked about it a little bit in terms of the definition that uh, micro learning has this sort of complex, vague way of being defined by an organization. But I think what that does in terms of long-term approach and whether this is here to stay is it allows it to be more adaptable to your organization. It allows it to fit to your culture, or even to your infrastructure. Things like technology will obviously play into this in many ways, in that certain businesses can't accommodate a mobile first design. It's not built into their nature or into their culture that they can't have devices on the floor, or they're not doing off of work training. I think it adapts to things like blended approach. So are you approaching things even like instructor led training, which we often talk about, this being an electronic form, but are you taking those same philosophies and applying that into your instructor led training, trying to find ways to pare down the training, make it more specific and segmented, if you will, to really deliver key messages in short bursts to kind of adhere to a learner's attention span. One of the things that was in the sort of long winded, and it goes on for a while beyond what Daniel read, it was the idea of mediated environments, and Daniel hit on it as well. Are you taking that long e-learning that you maybe traditionally have sitting in your library of content, and are you finding ways to put it into a more segmented, structured environment within your e-learning, your digital space as well? Are you turning it into a map or a game? Are you turning it into these broken up components where a learner can still take it in small chunks, but they don't have to sit for 30 minutes? I think there's a lot of flexibility in the way microlearning can be defined, applied, and really fit to an organization. I think that in and of itself, while maybe also being loosely defined as microlearning in general, allows it to have this sort of here to stay component to it.
So then on the original question of here to stay or buzzword, is microlearning technically a buzzword, and really what we're talking about is just analyzing e-learning into the modality that's correct for the user. It goes back to that, like I always ask the question of are we just analyzing our e-learning and saying that, hey, based upon who we're training and how we want to train them because of our philosophy and our strategy, that means we just need to make smaller, online learning components.
Maybe we have to agree that it's not a buzzword, because we've had trouble defining it just in the last few minutes. Maybe it is more about a philosophy, a way of thinking when you approach your training, rather than a buzzword. And we all like to cling to the catchy phrase or the really snazzy word that catches people's attention. But if you can't define it, maybe it's not a word. Maybe it is a more of a thought process or a strategy in the way you approach your training.
I can agree with that. Definitely.
So what I think that really poses is, whether it's philosophy, whether it's word, and I think we tend to agree it's probably more of a philosophy, it's an approach. But what is the value? Why do this? And I think that is a really great place for us to take our next segment.
What's the value of microlearning? I think I think you have to determine, whether it's here to stay. So when we talk about all the noise in the world that I mentioned earlier, in terms of how much content is out there, what we're seeing, if we're talking about retail training, retail sales, how many products they have to learn on that's in their category. If we're talking about, any sort of processes that are in the field in terms of a role or responsibility, there's so many things to learn. I think there's a lot of noise. So it really comes down to the learner's attention span, and making sure that we can retain the learner's attention to get across the objective. So when it comes to value, we probably want to look at, do I have a more engaged learner? Um, is the training more valuable when I'm presenting it to them in a smaller chunk that they can digest, get their point across, and really get on to their next task? Is what users are probably looking at. I think one thing about the world we live in today, and I'm going to use a reference in terms of the times we're going through right now, but is it's a very fast paced environment. Take your training, get back to work. It's not to it's the live to work concept, which I think North America is very much digested. I think that this time that we're in now has given everybody kind of a reflection point to look back and say, can I slow down a little bit? But I think microlearning fits into that overall philosophy of get the information that I need and get back to the next job, and then go on to the next task and go on to the next task. And whether the next task is going onto the sales floor and selling a product, going to change somebody's tire, going to manufacture a part in my plant, or doing something in healthcare, whatever it is. I think that the value of microlearning, it really comes down to the time it takes to deliver an objective clearly and concisely to a learner.
So you mentioned the reality of trying to gauge a learner's engagement, and with that comes, how do I measure that? And I think I've always called it the holy grail of learning is figuring out what your ROI is on any content that a learning development produces. Um, but if we kind of take it and we pare it down to trying to understand, if it's really about trying to gather the attention and retain that learner's attention for the objective at hand before you release them back, is there anything maybe that you see that we would be focusing on from sort of a metric or a data point, a strategy to try to gauge whether or not it's just consumption or is it actual application and behavior?
I think it's an interesting question because I think there has to be some sort of, obviously, a knowledge check, knowledge transfer. I don't like using the typical quiz at the end of the training, because it's easy enough to um, regurgitate information back after you've consumed it in the moment. But I think one of the things that we're working in terms of understanding what the engagement, interaction, and retention is like, is working with clients to create 30, 60, 90-day reviews, coaching opportunities with a manager after the fact. So taking training, taking a course, and then having no interaction afterwards to see if that practical knowledge has been transferred isn't great. I think some of the opportunities where we talk about product knowledge training, we're seeing interaction with the manufacturer of the product after the fact to ask questions, have Q&A, depending on obviously what environment the learner is in. But I think that opportunity to go back to the content on a regular scheduled time frame, whether it's 30, 60, 90 days, to get an additional knowledge check or an additional piece of information to keep things fresh. But also, like I mentioned earlier, I think the coaching is a huge part of it. And you still need that person-to-person feedback to make sure that your knowledge is where it should be after taking those sorts of those trainings.
I think you nailed it on the head in terms of the way I think about it as well as microlearning, especially if we take those original kind of categories of ways to define it in terms of objective and time and reduction of overall investment, I guess. Specifically, if you're looking at the objective portion and the overall seat time as being very small and compartmentalized, it's really easy to bring that back in as a refresher 30 days later, 60 days later, with something that isn't super time consuming. You don't have to necessarily go back and relearn it, but it's a chance to pop that seed back into the learner's brain and kind of reinforce that message, which I think is really good as well. So nicely stated there. When I look at the value of micro learning for myself, I'm taking a bit more of my long term experience in being part of larger corporate environments. When we talk about micro learning and we've had that conversation, it's almost always really for us been a financial argument. I think there's value to the learner, and you absolutely have to have that as kind of your front of mind component. How I'm going to make this easier for a learner to sit down, retain in the moment, get what they need, and move on. But from an organization perspective, if you're looking at a company who's investing the time in these trainings and more importantly in these people, and this applies probably more to sort of an enterprise solution where it's your employees that you're training as opposed to extended where you might be reaching out to partners and sales associates. It's really about that reduction in seat time. It is really about being more efficient with the time that they are spending. Because ultimately, let's face it, if you've got long seat time, that's usually going to equate to labor dollars or hours that you're budgeting into your annual cycle. And really being able to take that and trying to find ways to reduce it, not reduce the content is the hard part, right? You don't want to just throw things out to get rid of things, but it's really about how do you condense it, try to get rid of the minutia that's just the fluff that we tend to throw in because we wanted to try to cram just a little bit more in, a little bit more in. How do you really get to a defined topic, a defined purpose, get it as lean as possible while still retaining some of that information or the key information to reduce some of that seat time will affect budgets for people, right? And then if you really are focusing on being more directive, I think you're going to find that you're just more efficient with that time too. So it's a win on both fronts. You're getting really to the message that you meant to get to, and you're reducing that seat time. Those ultimately relate to a better balanced budget sheet when and a little bit easier to try to manage some of that. And that includes things like instructor led. Can you take your instructor led and find ways to produce portions of it even? Maybe you can take a 4-day training that was going to be off site, but you had to have people travel. Maybe you reduce a day of that by doing pre work that's digital. And now you've saved a day of hotel and food costs that come with that. I think that's how I've always viewed the value of micro learning, partially just because of the experience and the point of view I've always come at it from.
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask a follow up for you, Scott. I think we're very 30,000 feet with our views
Yep.
today on microlearning. It's there's a lot to cover. Um, you know, can you talk about how in your past life you would go through the process of a larger quantity of learning, a larger training, a larger ILT, and kind of breaking that down and get a bit more tactical. See if we can provide some value there for our listeners.
Yeah, I have a really kind of poignant example that I was kind of contemplating a time where we've sort of applied this, and usually I think it comes down to like either onboarding or safety or compliance training are the places where there's just it's kind of low hanging fruit where I think it's really easy to pick these apart. And much like a bill in Congress for in the U.S., they always get these hang on kind of little amendments and addendums that get thrown in right to a bill. And I think a lot of times that's the way training gets built when you're working with multiple partners within your organization is we're building this one training and they just have this little piece of information that they want to say, but they don't really want to build a whole e-learning around it. So it gets a Christmas tree it's an ornament on the tree that they just keep adding and adding and adding. And so for my past life, one e-learning that we really looked at was a health and safety course, but it was taking a learner from on slide 5, let's say, they were talking about chemical hazards and right how to clean up, and then on slide 7 it was how to have safety in the workplace around not or using like ladders correctly, and then on page 10 it was around active shooter and what are the procedures and policies around that. And like if you're a learner going through that, when we were evaluating it, that was again low hanging fruit. We looked for what are those disjointed messages that get me confused, get me tied up in those moments. And so when we did it, we said, look, all of those topics are important. We don't want to just throw them out because they're not uh, valuable or that the learner isn't going to learn, but they don't make sense together. And that was really easy way for us to sort of break up that content and say, look, we need a course on chemical spills and we need a course on ladder safety, but maybe they don't need to be all part of what ultimately was about a 25-minute e-learning. Let's break them down so they're easy to digest. You're getting the message that you actually are trying to land. And specifically for the learner, I think and we didn't even talk about this from a value perspective, and I don't know that it's even always top of mind, but replayability in terms of content. When I need information that I remember I took, how easy is it to go back and go, man, I don't remember the seventh bullet in the step, or I don't remember this one button I'm supposed to hit in this system that was taught to me. Can you go back and grab that, or are you filtering through 20 minutes of content trying to get back to it? So that was one really good example. Another one that I can think of really fast, and I'll try to be brief, not always my best quality or skill, but I will do my best, was we took an onboarding course, all about the company. And this was one of those 90-minute courses when I came into the environment, and kind of everyone said, look, it drones on. And we just looked at, we didn't want to really lose all of the content, but we didn't want someone to have to sit for 90 minutes and try to navigate through that. So we added a little bit of gamification to it, which I thought was fun. Put the users more in a journey and a path kind of thing across the US. And we broke that up into really easy to digest, consistent topics that didn't ramble. They didn't go back and forth. So you took unit 1 and then unit 2 and then unit 3. And the idea was that it could also be bookmarked. You could come back to that environment and you only had to sit for 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and ultimately took that 90-minute course down to 45. So those are just a couple quick examples of ways that I've approached it in my past life to get that content to be more micromanaged, or not micromanaged, but micro content based. And we had pretty good feedback in both cases.
So one common theme, and I think this may be a topic of to throw into the category of things we want to talk about on the podcast. But do you feel like when it comes down to that transition you mentioned from the health and safety course, do you think it really comes down to writing better learning objectives? Do you think that unclear like learning objectives like understand how this product works or understand the process of removing this, do you think that those are just too vague and allow the stakeholders to ramble on, and create larger seat times in trainings based upon throwing a lot of facts? Because really, if you want to understand a process, we could pack it full of information that goes on for days. Whereas if you wrote more concise learning objectives, um, learn how to learn the number one objection of the customer in this scenario. I think. Do you think maybe that would help creating more bite-sized learning?
I think it never will hurt. That's the reality. And a lot of it comes down to how you intake that content and you work with those partners or those clients to define what is sort of the two-step approach, is just what is it you're trying to solve. If they can even answer that, and if their answer is I'm trying to check a box for my manager, my boss told me I need to go make a learning, we got to start somewhere else. That's not going to produce the best content if that's the reality. So really asking them to define what is the behavior you're trying to adjust. And then, yes, to your point, writing an objective that meets that specific goal and making it action-based. I think that's, you used the word understand. And I think I've seen that in learning objectives for the last couple decades. And it always kind of drives me nuts, because what does that mean to any one person? And how do I take that back and actually apply that in my job? So are we using action verbs to define what they're trying to do, and is it meeting a specific purpose? I think if you're using those as guideposts to your content, you're going to end up with more concise training, more efficient training, and probably meeting more of the standards of the microlearning.
All right, I think that's a great way to kind of cap off that. What is the value of microlearning segment? And I think that I feel like microlearning as a topic is probably going to make its way back around. I know we have some fun guests lined up in the next, whether they're content developers or learning development managers or those things from Haylight and from others who I think I'd love their perspective on microlearning, and this may be something that definitely comes up. I think we'd encourage the audience to send in some questions potentially about what we talked about today, or maybe just comments in general. So I think with that, on that note, Scott, I'll let you take us to our next segment.
Sounds good. Let's put microlearning to bed for today, and we will. You pointed it out. It's going to come back up. That's all right. one of the things we've said we're going to do on this podcast from day one is we want this to be a fun environment. We want it to be goofy. We want it to be a little silly. We want to just have a good conversation, but we also want it to be positive. The idea is not to tear down anything that's happening in the world or the industry, and we always want to kind of point out the good that we're seeing in the world today. And right now is our chance. We both are going to just bring something that we've seen, experienced, talked about, whatever it is, and bring it to the forefront. So we're sharing what we're seeing in the world that we think is really great. And right now, for me, one of the things that I'm noticing as we all move to this remote and world and this kind of isolated environment is the reach out that we're getting in the creative space online, the artistic and the music. I think online has always been a place for people to get noticed. It's always been a place for you to put out your skills in terms of the way you can sing or dance or play music. But we're seeing even more of it, and probably the real value to me is that it's much more altruistic. It's designed to bring positivity into the world. Whether you're looking at Yo-Yo Ma, who is playing a cello piece on a daily basis that just inspires him and putting that out into the world, or Josh Gad, for those of you who don't have kids, is the voice of Olaf in Frozen, amongst other things. He's reading children bedtime stories in crazy voices and applying some of his skills in a way that he's never really had to do before, or maybe hasn't publicly done as much. For anyone who needs to check it out, the iHeartRadio Living Room concert, Elton John put it on to raise funds. I have seen the Backstreet Boys singing "I Want It That Way" as part of just them all in their unique spaces in their homes, but really fun. They got their families involved. I just like seeing that going out in the world, and I think social media is bringing us some really cool moments like that. So, it doesn't all have to be doom and gloom. It can be a bit daunting to live in the world we are, especially if you're just watching all the news organizations and it seems very down. There are a lot of people trying to pump some positivity back into the world and make us feel a little bit of hope and an excitement. So, Daniel, how about you? What are you seeing out there that kind of sparks your enjoyment?
Yeah, I think probably I had this talk with my mom the other day. Obviously, I mentioned on the original podcast I have a 7-week-old daughter. Obviously, Grandma can't come visit right now. But I think the one thing that the positive thing is just the connection. The other day I had a Zoom call with my brother. My side of the family, my brothers, my mom, and my older brother's fiance, and or sorry, they're married now. My older brother's wife. I think I'm going to get criticized for that. But and their whole side of the family, and we literally played. We played a game on Zoom together, and I think what it's really making us realize, and what I think has been positive, is people going in, whether they're making fun TikToks with their mom and dad and their families, or they're putting out fun Instagram videos, or having great Zoom meetings and Zoom calls. I think what the positive thing for me is how much time people are spending with their families, and realizing that, like, hey, when this all changes, we should probably make a conscious effort to spend more time together because we're not that busy. But I think there's been a positive moment of families bonding, families being together, families coming closer together and making the most of this time together, which I think has been a really positive experience for myself. And I think for others as well, to kind of see that positive content that families as a whole are putting out in the world.
You mentioned it very early in the podcast, and I think it speaks to that a lot. Is are we all kind of taking that moment and saying it's okay to just slow down, right? We all live in a crazy, hectic environment, whether it's work, whether it's family, whether it's kids' activities, whatever that is. And I think more people are taking that moment to just say, let's slow down. Let's check in with the people we can't see regularly. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I think on that note, just before we wrap things up, I think not that an economic situation like we're in now is a good thing at all, but there's a reason why they call it a correction. And I think that it was time from a whether it's how we treat the environment, whether it's how we go about a day-to-day life. I think it was time for us to have a little bit of a correction and go back to what's important. And I think that although it can be a little bit downing at sometimes, I think this has been a great time for us to reflect and push in and find some positivities of way to interact and act. So I don't want to go down that road very much, but I think I think there's gonna be a lot of positive that comes out of the situation we're in, which is definitely the glass half full person that I am, but I'm excited for that. So Scott, on that note, I'll let you wrap it up as we've been going through podcast number 2.
Podcast number 2, all on micro-learning. We hope you learned a little bit today. Hopefully we shared some insights that helped clear anything up on micro-learning. As we said, it is currently kind of a undefined space, and you have to kind of find your own niche in it. That'll do it for us today. We do want to know, what is your take on microlearning? How is it being used in your organization? Maybe you have a completely different point of view on everything we talked about today. There's nothing wrong with that. We do want to hear from you. So if you have comments, suggestions for future topics, questions that we can attempt to answer as we go ahead on this podcast journey, please send us an email at podcast@halite.com. That's podcast@halite.com. Also, be sure to check us out. We have a weekly blog that we put out, sometimes even more than once a week if you're when we're feeling particularly generous. But that's you can find that at our website, halite.com, HALIGHT.com.
Yeah, and on that note, you be sure to subscribe to the podcast on whatever kind of platform you're listening on. Rate, review. We love your feedback. Maybe if it's a 1-star review, you can just kind of email that to us privately. I'm kidding. You can rate whatever you feel on the podcast, but we love your feedback, and be sure to follow us and check up what's new and trending on all of our social medias. You can find us at Halite, HALIGHT Inc. So that's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, all Halite Inc.
Awesome. Thanks again. I'm Scott Babcock. He's Daniel Mendonça, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of If You Build It, Will They Learn? Be sure to check us out on the web at www.halite.com. That's www.HALIGHT.com.